The rain didn't make a sound under the furs. It just clung to everything. Needles barked the backs of our gloves. I remember the tech's hand pausing in the muck, a thumb clearing a sliver of soil from a thin band of plastic no larger than a wristwatch strap. A name still legible after years in the ground curved along that pale arc like a whisper that had been waiting its turn. Let me know where you're listening from and share this if you believe remembering is the first step toward justice. I have worked long nights most of my life, but Sunday nights in Meadow Ridge used to be their own kind of quiet. The paper mill breathed a steady sigh across the river, the diner closed at 9, and the hospital's parking lot just up the hill from the courthouse thinned to a neat scatter of cars under lamps that hummed like porch insects in August. Most weeks my radio stayed polite. We measured our hours by coffee refills and the click of the wall clock in our squad room, the kind of rhythm people move to when they trust the ground under their feet. Back then, I rented a little house 2 miles from downtown, 1-story, with a lean-to carport and a crabapple tree that dumped leaves like confetti after every gust. My wife kept a quilt on the back of the couch. Our boy, just out of high school, left his catcher's mitt on the kitchen table like that was where it belonged. If the weather dropped below 40, the heat in that old place let you know about it. You'd walk down the hall and feel cool air settle against the baseboards. I used to blame it on the crawl space and tell myself I'd fix it in the spring. Spring has a way of sounding like a promise even when it's only a plan. Meadow Ridge wasn't special to anyone who didn't live there, and that was fine by us. We had a feed store that folded into a hardware aisle without warning, a grocery where you could buy fishing line at the register, and a hospital that smelled like antiseptic and warm blankets. The maternity ward sat at the end of the 3rd floor with windows that faced the trees. When the fog came in off the lowlands, those windows filled with it like a lake rising, and the nurses said it made the babies sleep better. I never had reason to argue. You let people keep the small good stories that help them do their work. Jennifer Hayes chose a baby blanket at that grocery on a Friday afternoon in early March. I did not meet her then. I learned the shape of her ordinary days later, combing receipts and little testimonies that live in memory because they don't mean anything until they do. She stood by the end cap with 2 colors in her hands, soft yellow and a blue pale enough to be almost gray. The checker remembered because Jennifer laughed when she decided the kind of laugh that lifts a room without taking over, and said the yellow felt like sunlight. The baby doesn't care about colors, the checker added later with a shrug, but she looked happy holding it. It's funny what survives the way a person's shoulders sit when they're at ease, the roll of a cart's wobbly wheel, a stranger's small kindness at 3 in the afternoon. David Hayes kept his life tidy. He stacked mail with the stamps aligned in the top right corner, folded towels the long way, and parked their sedan nose out in the driveway. A neighbor down the block, retired, the kind of man who notices, said David waved most mornings when he left for the office, 2 fingers off the steering wheel, not a production. On Sundays he carried in a paper and stood by the porch light screwing in a bulb that seemed to burn out every other week. You could set your watch by him, the neighbor told me years later, tapping the memory like a mason, checks for a sure stone. In towns like ours, steadiness is a form of love. The hospital ran on that same steadiness. You'd hear the elevator chime the rubber hush of souls on waxed floor monitors murmuring behind curtains. The maternity ward kept a small library of dog-eared paperbacks, romances, thrillers, and 1 old field guide to birds that had no business being there and never left. Nurses drifted in with the habit of people who work where the stakes stay high and the tone stays soft. I knew some of them by first name because over time makes neighbors of us all birthdays in break rooms, potlucks where someone's best casserole goes home, empty stories traded over coffee at 2 in the morning while the city sleeps. Linda Chen put 12-hour shifts to bed like it was an art form, charting neat as ledger lines, hair tied back, voice steady when mothers were scared or fathers looked like they might sit down on the linoleum. She had 8 years in, and the ward felt a fraction calmer when she was on. Robert Chen, her husband, came to the courthouse from time to time for records. He had a way of lowering his voice across the counter that made clerks lean in and then smile back. Former paralegal kept a notebook wrote with a fountain pen that left a handsome line. I think about the way people carry themselves, the quiet ones who never raise a fuss, who hold doors and say after you. It's easy to mistake poise for peace. That weekend, the temperature rode in the mid-40s, damp enough that your coat kept a cold shine by the time you reached your destination. The forecast talked about a break in the weather by Tuesday. There's an optimism in spring reports around here even when the fronts don't cooperate. On Sunday evening, after the 6 o'clock news, the town settled into its usual habits. The bowling alley turned on its pin-setters. The diner ran the last pot of decaf. A choir finished up rehearsal at the church with the brick bell tower and walked out into the kind of air that lays a hand on your shoulder. At the hospital, the nursing board showed a manageable night. 1 induction scheduled for the morning, 2 labor checks expected around midnight. A handful of patients tucked in and listening to the soft throb of their own machines. Maintenance had been crawling around all day, swapping out a run of door hardware old badge readers that had been giving them fits. If you knew where to look, you could find a roll of caution tape leaning against a mop closet and a toolbox tucked just out of sight behind an ice machine. The fellow on maintenance duty left notes with dates and times like all the good ones do. He wrote in block letters underlined once where the scheduler needed to order parts and drew a little arrow to a side exit where the reader would be off the network until Monday. I read that ticket later. The ink had bled through a little as if the pen tip pressed down exactly as hard as the writer's sense of competence demanded. Jennifer liked to sit with her hands over the swell of her belly and watch the screen where the heart rate fluttered the regular sawtooth that says, "You're okay" in a language older than our machines. A nurse showed her how to adjust the bed and where the call button hid toward the rail's little right-angle symbol you can find with your thumb even in the dark. She told her the coffee machine in the hall spat out decent hot chocolate and that the custodian with the tattoos of birds on her forearm kept extra blankets in the warmer. Jennifer smiled and made a note in her phone to remind David to bring the small overnight bag she'd packed and repacked so many times she could list the contents in her sleep. She had comfortable socks folded at the top. The yellow blanket waited on a chair at home, folded and refolded since Friday. David spent the afternoon clearing a spot in the hallway closet for the car seat box. He told me he'd measured twice because the shelf had a lip and he didn't want to force anything. This is what preparation looks like at the edge of a new life, a man in his 30s level in hand, proud of a small invisible square, being square. He left the porch light on when they drove to the hospital habit more than intention. "We'll be back in a few hours," he said at the door, and she laughed and said, "We'll see. Plans in March bend the way branches do flex, then hold." At the station, the evening shift rolled in with parkas zipped up to their chins. I finished one report on a fender bender near the feed store and started another on a neighbor dispute that boiled down to hedges pretending to be fences. The radio checked in with a traffic stop out by mile marker 15. Dispatch read back a list of plates to a deputy who could recite half the town's birthdays if you asked him to. Nothing urgent, just the gears meshing like always. I poured more coffee, watched condensation write slow runnels down the window, and thought about calling home to ask if my boy needed the car on Monday. Domestic life leans best when you adjust it a notch at a time. Linda took her dinner break around 7:30 and sat by the staff window with a container of soup balanced on a napkin. She ate like people who've learned to finish before the intercom speaks. She might have looked out over the pines to the place where the road fell away into town, where headlights stitched the hill in a long patient zipper. A coworker, younger nurse with new shoes, asked about a recipe for the lemon bars somebody brought last week. Linda said they came from a neighbor and promised to copy it down. I know this because the younger nurse told me later, cheeks pink with the shame of remembering something small when other things were so large. Nothing is wasted. Nothing is too small. Inside the Hayes house, the overnight bag waited near the door. A folded list lay on top, chargers, toiletries, a book with a ribbon tucked at the place where Jennifer had stopped to answer the doorbell 2 nights earlier when a neighbor dropped off a casserole just in case. The thermostat clicked. The furnace answered. Out front, the porch light pulled a small circle out of the gray. At the hospital, a soft beeping reminded a nurse to change a sensor. Somewhere down the hall, a monitor printer spun out a short strip of paper with a rhythm that sounded like a low voice humming to itself. The side exit by the staff lot stood closed. Its badge reader dark, the metal plate under it showing the faint thumbprints left by a day of handling. A handwritten sign asked staff to use the main corridor. Someone had underlined, "Please." I have looked at that sign in my head 1,000 times and thought only of tone, how we talk to each other in places where care is the cornerstone. I made a pass through the hospital lobby just after 8. It's what I do sometimes walk, where the quiet collects, check the edges, let the atmosphere settle in my chest before the night leans forward. The volunteer at the desk knitted under a lamp with a shade the color of tea. A custodian steered his cart around the potted ficus that never looked right in that corner. The coffee machine hissed and reset. I nodded at the security guard who had a crossword folded in his pocket like a talisman against boredom. We said good evening without stopping. It is good to leave certain rooms exactly as you found them. On the way back to my car, the mill's exhale drifted across the river and flattened against the hill. A weightless pressure that makes you aware of your own breathing. I looked up at the third-floor windows, those rectangles of light behind which first cries and first silences find their earliest measure. It's a human thing to look up and imagine blessing traveling through glass. You don't say it out loud. You just stand on the sidewalk for a breath before you move on. Across town, Sarah Mitchell finished grading essays at her kitchen table, red pen parked at the margin where she'd written a kind note for a 7th grader who needed one. She poured tea and set it on a cork coaster that had browned with years of use. Her porch light burned steady under a halo of damp air. On Monday, she'd lead a staff meeting about attendance. She didn't know she would carry a stranger's story in her pocket for the rest of the year. I drove past the Hayes place at 8:30 on my way to a welfare check for an older couple whose daughter couldn't reach them. The porch light at that little ranch on Sycamore drew a neat yellow circle on the walk, a clean invitation for anyone who belonged there. I remember thinking the grass would need its first cut soon. By the time I finished with the welfare check false alarm, the television's volume had masked the phone. The fog thickened enough to make the traffic lights bleed their colors onto the wet asphalt. Back at the station, I set my coffee on a stack of forms and listened to the building settle. The clock on the wall moved forward in that quiet way clocks do when no one is watching. Somewhere a car door shut. A pair of footsteps angled across a lot slick from mist, and a door latch clicked in a manner that felt routine to the ears that heard it. On Sycamore, the overnight bag waited by the door zipper tabs aligned like small silver commas. The porch light burned on, drawing its circle a little tighter as the fog pressed in. And up on the hill, the hospital held its breath just for a moment before the night decided what it would keep and what it would take. The porch light still burned when the fog rolled in heavier, softening the shapes of houses and mailboxes until the street looked half asleep. I remember sitting at my desk finishing a welfare check report when the dispatcher's phone crackled through the stillness. It wasn't urgent at first, a call from County Memorial about a missing patient, which in hospital language usually meant someone confused or restless had wandered into the wrong hallway. The nurse on the line sounded more puzzled than panicked. "She just left," she said. Her husband came back from home, and she was gone. I wrote the name down on the notepad in front of me. Jennifer Hayes, 26 maternity ward. 8 months pregnant. That combination of words stopped me mid-sentence. The hospital sat 5 minutes from the station. I told dispatch I'd head over. By the time I pulled into the staff lot, the mist had turned to a fine wet drizzle that made every beam of light bloom into a halo. Two nurses stood near the side door with their arms folded tight, their scrubs sticking to them. They looked young and shaken. Inside, the security guard met me at the front desk, pale and sweating under the fluorescent lights. "She walked out about 30 minutes ago," he said, his voice small, almost embarrassed. "We didn't know until her husband came back." He led me to the monitor room where the surveillance screens glowed in rows of gray and green static. On one of them, I watched the clock in the corner tick past 8:47 p.m. as a woman in a hospital gown stepped out of her room. Her gait was slow but steady, her eyes unfocused like she was sleepwalking. She passed right by the nurses' station, where two staff members were turned away, handling another patient. Then she pushed open the stairwell door and disappeared down. On the ground-level camera, I saw her again barefoot, her gown tied unevenly at the back, the ID bracelet bright against her wrist. She crossed the hallway and reached for the metal door that led out to the staff lot. The timestamp read 8:52. The door swung open easily, though it shouldn't have. Maintenance had disabled the lock earlier that day, and it hadn't been rearmed yet. The angle of the camera ended at the curb. She moved out of frame and never came back. I watched the loop 3 times before I turned to the guard. "Do you have another camera covering the outer lot?" He shook his head. "That section's been down for 2 weeks," he said. The words landed like gravel in my throat. We started the search inside first, as procedure demanded. Every hallway, every closet, bathroom, supply rooms. Nurses opened curtains and empty beds, calling her name softly as if she might answer from behind a partition. The air smelled of antiseptic and warm plastic. Around us, other patients slept or stirred, unaware that something irreversible had just begun in the next corridor. When nothing turned up, we moved outside. Officers fanned through the parking lots with flashlights while maintenance unlocked the service gate so we could sweep the wooded slope behind the hospital. The brush was slick from mist. Our lights scattered against trunks and glistened on the wet grass. David Hayes arrived before midnight. He was shaking so badly that the clipboard nurse had to steady his hand just to sign the consent forms for a search. "She told me to go home," he kept saying. "She told me to get the bag." I led him to a small room off the main lobby where we could talk away from the noise. On the table sat her phone, her purse and her folded clothes still in the closet where she'd left them. He looked at them for a long moment before sitting down. "She wouldn't leave those," he said quietly. "She's not that kind of person." I asked him about her state of mind. Any stress lately? Any arguments, worries about the baby? He shook his head. "She was excited," he said. "Tired, sure, but happy." He rubbed his forehead and let out a breath that came out more like a sob. "She called her mom that afternoon, told her she'd send pictures once the baby came." We sat there in the kind of silence that falls when facts run out and instinct starts whispering. Back in the lot, the K9 team had arrived. The dogs caught Jennifer's scent from her hospital room and followed it through the stairwell out the side door and into the night. The trail ended near the far fence line at the edge of the blind zone where the cameras stopped. There were tire tracks there, old the kind you see in any employee lot, but the rain made it impossible to tell when they'd been laid down. We marked the spot anyway. By 2 a.m, the fog thickened to a wall. We had to call off the ground search until daylight. In the following days, Meadow Ridge changed. People kept their porch lights on longer, as if the glow might help her find her way back. Volunteers combed the fields beyond the hospital, their boots sucking in the mud. Flyers went up on telephone poles in grocery store windows inside coffee shops. The photo David provided showed Jennifer at a baby shower wearing a soft blue dress, her hair pinned back. In the picture, her hands rested on her belly, and she looked like someone standing right at the edge of joy. That was the image that stared out from every lamppost. We interviewed everyone who'd worked that shift: orderlies, cafeteria staff, security, maintenance nurses. Most remembered routine things: a patient moved to another room, a spill cleaned up a brief lull before the next contraction alarm went off, But one nurse, Linda Chen, said she'd seen Jennifer earlier that evening when she was admitted. She described her as calm and polite. No distress, nothing unusual. When I asked if she'd seen her after that, she said no. She was helping with another patient around that time. Her tone was steady professional. I thanked her, jotted a few notes, and moved on. There was nothing in her demeanor that stood out. No nerves, no deflection. She looked like what she was supposed to look like, a caregiver. We checked traffic cameras on the main road leaving the hospital, but none faced the right angle to catch the staff lot. No witnesses reported a woman walking barefoot that night, no vehicle spotted picking someone up. Every lead flattened into silence. By the end of the week, the search area extended 10 miles in every direction. Helicopters scanned with infrared. Divers swept nearby ponds. Nothing. No trace of a woman 8 months pregnant in a thin hospital gown on a 45-degree night. The theories came fast, each one more improbable than the last. Some thought she'd wandered off in confusion, maybe a reaction to medication. Others whispered about postpartum panic, though the baby hadn't even come yet. A few wondered if she'd been taken. David refused to believe any of it. She wouldn't walk away, he told the reporters gathered outside their house. If she could call me, she would. I remember standing behind the caution tape that morning, the wind cutting across the yard, watching his hand tremble as he held up their last ultrasound photo. "She's still out there," he said. His voice broke on the word still. Weeks passed. The flyers grew soft around the edges from rain. Calls trickled in sightings that went nowhere. Tips from psychics, even one from a trucker who swore he'd seen a woman hitchhiking in the next county. Each one ended in disappointment. I watched David unravel in slow motion, sleep less, speak less, show up to the station every few days just to sit and ask if there was news. I'd seen grief take many shapes over the years, but the kind that comes without a body, without proof, carries its own special cruelty. Summer arrived before we accepted that the trail had gone cold. The coroner's office issued an official assumption of death, mother and child both presumed lost. I signed off on the report. My pen felt heavy that day, like it was writing an ending that wasn't earned. What none of us could have guessed then was that Jennifer Hayes had indeed given birth not in a hospital, but in a cabin 2 hours north, miles off any paved road. That she'd been alive for 4 more days, calling for help no one could hear. The people responsible for taking her were right there in the photographs of that search, one of them even in scrubs helping tape flyers to the hospital door. But we didn't know that yet. For 13 years, the file sat in a cabinet marked unresolved. I moved on to other cases, runaways, overdoses, domestic disputes that left rooms full of broken things. I retired once, came back part-time because I wasn't built for quiet. Life filled the space Jennifer's name used to occupy, but it never erased it. It was always there, faint as a heartbeat through static. Then, one evening in early spring 2023, I got a call from a school counselor named Sarah Mitchell in a town about an hour south. She said she had a student, 13 years old, bright but withdrawn, whose background didn't add up. No medical history before age 5, no early childhood photos, parents who'd moved from town to town. It's probably nothing she said, but something about this girl's eyes. She looks familiar. I asked for the student's name. She told me Maya Chen. For a moment I couldn't place it. Then the surname landed in my chest like a dropped stone. I pulled Jennifer's file from storage that night, spread the old photographs across my desk. The paper smelled faintly of dust and toner. I flipped to the employment list from the hospital's maternity ward in 2010. There it was. Linda Chen, registered nurse evening shift, March 14th. My pulse quickened, a slow, rising tide of dread and recognition. I cross-checked addresses. The Chens had left Meadow Ridge 2 months after Jennifer disappeared. No forwarding address, just a note in payroll saying moving to be closer to family. The next morning, I called Sarah back. My voice felt steady, but I could feel the tremor underneath. I asked for the girl's birth certificate information and the parents' first names. She read them out, Linda and Robert Chen. I thanked her, hung up, and stared at the receiver for a long time before calling the lab for a rush DNA comparison. When the results came in, I was sitting in my car outside the station. The sun was dropping behind the hills, painting the windshields gold. The lab tech's voice was quiet, professional. "It's a match," she said. 99.9%. I didn't answer right away. There was a moment of stillness so complete I could hear my own breath. Jennifer's daughter. The child we'd all believed lost had been alive all this time, growing up under a name that belonged to her mother's killer. I turned the key in the ignition and drove toward the address Sarah had given me. The road wound through damp pine and low fog, same as it had that night 13 years before. Every mile carried me closer to the truth we'd missed, and to a child who didn't yet know that her entire life was built on a lie. The rain started again just outside Town Light, but steady, the kind that makes the wipers whisper instead of slap. I remember thinking how quiet it was, how familiar that sound had become rain on glass years between breaths, and how for the first time in over a decade the silence around Jennifer Hayes was about to break. When I pulled up to the address the counselor had given me, the sky was the color of tin. It had been drizzling for hours, that light Oregon rain that never quite stops, just hangs in the air until everything feels damp. The house sat on a narrow road, lined with pines, small and neat, with the kind of symmetry you only get when someone's spent a lifetime keeping their world under control. A white porch swing, 2 identical flower pots, blinds drawn tight. From the outside, nothing looked remarkable. If you'd driven past, you'd have thought it was just another family trying to stretch a paycheck and keep to themselves. But inside that house was a girl whose name, whose very life, didn't belong to her. I met the girl first. Maya was smaller than I expected, 13, quiet with a kind of politeness that didn't match her age. She kept glancing toward the doorway where her mother, Linda Chen, stood arms crossed, lips pressed tight. There was a tension in the air that made you instinctively lower your voice. I asked Maya a few simple questions about school, about her interests. She said she liked math, animals, reading. She avoided eye contact when I mentioned birthdays, and she froze when I asked where she was born. Linda cut in with a quick, practiced answer, Jefferson County Birthing Center. It's closed now. Her voice was even rehearsed, like she'd said that line 100 times. I thanked them for their time, left politely, and sat in my car for a long minute before calling the station. My gut had started to hum in that low, familiar way it does when something is very wrong but not yet visible. The next morning, I sent a request to the birthing center she mentioned. The response came back within an hour. No record of a Linda or Robert Chen ever being patients. No record of any child named Maya. I dug further employment records, hospital rosters from 2010. Linda had been on shift the night Jennifer Hayes disappeared, then called in sick for the next 4 days. After that, she resigned. On paper, it all looked ordinary, a nurse leaving to raise a family. But behind it, there was a gap you could drive a truck through. I stared at her signature on that resignation form, the careful loops and steady lines, and tried to imagine what kind of person could carry a lie for 13 years without faltering. When we got the warrant for DNA samples, I remember the sound of the rain against the car roof as we parked in front of their house again. It was late afternoon gray and close. Linda opened the door before we even knocked, as if she'd been watching from the window. She tried to smile, but her face couldn't hold it. "Is this really necessary?" she asked. I told her it was routine. Her husband Robert hovered behind her, pale and thin hands shoved deep into his pockets. He didn't speak at all. Maya looked scared but curious. She didn't understand what was happening. We swabbed, documented, thanked them for their cooperation. Linda kept repeating that there must be some mistake. When I turned to leave, she called after me, her voice sharper than before. "You'll see. It's all a misunderstanding." I didn't answer. I'd heard those words too many times in too many houses that looked just like hers. The results came back 2 days later. I was in the station kitchen pouring bad coffee when the call came through. The tech's voice was steady, but I could tell she'd taken a breath before speaking. "Detective, the DNA's a match. The girl Maya, she's biologically related to Jennifer Hayes." I set the cup down. Didn't even feel it spill. For a second, the room seemed to go quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. After 13 years, the missing woman from the maternity ward hadn't vanished into the night or drowned in some forgotten ravine. She had given birth, and that child had been living under another woman's roof calling her mother. We moved fast after that. The arrest warrant was signed before dawn. By mid-morning, 3 patrol cars pulled into the Chen's street. The neighbors stood on porches, coats pulled over pajamas. When we knocked, Linda opened the door again, and this time her face was colorless. She tried to close it, but Robert's voice broke the stillness. "Let them in," he said quietly. His eyes looked hollow, like someone who hadn't slept in years. Inside, the air smelled like lemon cleaner and something metallic, maybe nerves, maybe fear. We separated them standard procedure. I sat with Robert in the kitchen while another detective took Linda into the living room. The wallpaper was covered in photos of Maya, birthdays, school portraits, family trips, but not one of Linda pregnant, not one from before age 5. Robert stared at the pictures like he was seeing them for the first time. When I read him his rights, he started to cry. Not loud, not the kind that demands attention, but slow, quiet tears that came from someplace old and tired. Then, without prompting, he began to talk. He told me that Linda had wanted a baby for years. 3 miscarriages, doctor's visits, hope that turned to bitterness. She couldn't let it go, he said. Every time one of her patients had a child, it tore her apart. When Jennifer Hayes came in that night glowing full term alone for a moment, something inside Linda broke. She'd told Robert she was going to check on a patient. Instead, she led Jennifer out through the stairwell and into their car. "I thought she'd lost her mind," he said. But she kept saying it was fate, that God was giving her a chance. They took Jennifer to their old family cabin 2 hours north, secluded off a logging road they barely used anymore. "She gave birth there," Robert whispered. "Linda helped her. A girl. Healthy." His hands shook as he spoke. Jennifer wanted to hold her, but Linda wouldn't let her. She said the baby was hers now. When I asked what happened next, he couldn't look at me. He stared down at the table, knuckles white. Jennifer wouldn't stop begging. She said she'd never tell anyone, just let her go home. Linda said she couldn't risk it, that she'd take the baby and make it right. His voice cracked then, and for the first time I felt something like pity for him. He'd been weak, complicit, but maybe never cruel. "She gave her a shot," he said finally. Said it would calm her down. It didn't. It killed her. He covered his face with both hands. "We buried her behind the cabin. I told Linda we had to tell the police that it had gone too far. She said if I did, we'd lose the baby and both go to prison. And I believed her." In the living room, Linda was still insisting Jennifer had left after giving birth, that she'd run away and abandoned the baby. When I told her we'd found the cabin deed still in Robert's name, her expression cracked for the first time. "You don't know what it's like," she said, "to hold something that perfect and know it's finally yours." I remember feeling an emptiness in the space between her words, the kind that only comes from years of self-delusion. We drove out to the cabin that same afternoon. The road narrowed to gravel, then to mud. Pines pressed close on both sides, and the air smelled like wet bark and decay. The property sat where the forest thickened a sagging structure with moss climbing up its siding. Robert rode in the back seat, staring out the window, silent. When we reached the clearing, he pointed toward a rise behind the house. "Up there," he said. "Under the rocks." The ground was soft from spring rain. Our forensics team moved carefully, sectioning off the area, scraping layer by layer until one of them called out. I walked over. The soil had changed color, darker, richer. They brushed it away with gloved hands until a small curve of bone appeared, then the edge of fabric, what looked like the hem of a hospital gown. And near it, half buried, was a fragment of plastic. I leaned closer and could just make out the faded letters pressed into it. Jennifer Hayes. The world seemed to go silent for a moment. No birds, no wind, just the sound of our breathing and the distant drip of rain through the trees. When the remains were lifted, I called David Hayes. He answered on the second ring. I told him we'd found her. I don't remember exactly what he said, just the sound he made, low and raw, like something breaking after being held together too long. For 13 years he'd lived with a question that had no answer. Now he had one, and it was worse than any he'd imagined. Maya was placed in protective custody that evening. She didn't cry when we explained what was happening. She just looked at us, eyes wide, as if the air had been pulled out of the room. I thought about the scar the school nurse had noticed on her wrist, that faint circle where a hospital ID once sat. I thought about the years she'd spent growing up in a house built on lies, calling her mother the woman who'd killed her real one. There's no handbook for how to tell a child that kind of truth. We just did what we could, kept our voices soft, stayed close by, and hoped the world would find a way to right itself around her. That night, when I drove back to the station, the rain finally stopped. The sky cleared enough for a sliver of moon to show through. I passed the hospital on the hill, its windows glowing against the dark, like a row of watchful eyes. Somewhere inside, new babies were crying, mothers were sleeping, fathers were pacing halls with coffee cups in hand, life continuing as it always does. But I knew that building would never look the same to me again. I slowed as I passed the side entrance, the one with the broken badge reader all those years ago. For a long time I sat there with the engine running, listening to the quiet tick of cooling metal. The case had answers now, but not peace. The truth was buried deeper than that grave woven through years of silence and stolen moments. And though Jennifer Hayes had finally been found, her daughter's story, what would become of her, who she would be after all this, was only just beginning. When the excavator lifted the last layer of soil from the hillside behind that cabin, the forest went silent. I remember the smell. Wet cedar turned earth, something older underneath it all. The forensic tech brushed the dirt back with a gloved hand, revealing the curve of a skull faintly yellow beneath the film of mud. We knew before the lab confirmed it. It was Jennifer. I'd stood beside graves before, but this one carried a kind of stillness that didn't belong to the woods. We found what was left of a hospital gown tangled in the roots, and near it a small strip of plastic curved in on itself like a bracelet. The lettering was faded, but under the light her name came through. Jennifer Hayes. The rain picked up light and steady tapping against the canopy as if the forest itself wanted to mark the moment. Robert sat in the back of the cruiser while we worked. He didn't try to look away, didn't say a word. When I walked over to tell him they'd confirmed the find, he just nodded. "I told you where she was," he said quietly. His voice had that hollow sound people get when they've stopped fighting the truth. Linda, on the other hand, was shouting from the porch of the cabin, still insisting Jennifer had walked away after giving birth, still spinning the story she'd built her life around. Even when we read her the charges, she shook her head like she was the one being wronged. The kind of denial that's woven into a person's bones, there's no reaching it. The medical examiner's report came through 3 days later. Morphine overdose. The levels in her bone marrow were sky high, a dose that would have put her under in minutes. It was confirmation of what Robert had said, but hearing it in those clean, clinical words still hit hard. I thought of David sitting alone in his kitchen 13 years earlier, waiting for a call that never came. Now he had his answer, and it came wrapped in evidence bags and autopsy notes. We brought him to the morgue under gray morning light. He stood beside the table for a long time without speaking. The sheet covered everything except the bracelet still sealed in its evidence sleeve. "She didn't run," he said at last. His voice was steady but faint. "She never would have left." Then he turned toward me. "You said there's a child." I nodded. "She's alive," I told him. "We're making sure she's safe." For a second, his face broke open. Grief, disbelief, joy all tangled together. Then the tears came, the kind that leave a person gasping between breaths. Maya was in state custody by then. I'd gone to see her the day after the arrests, just to check in. She sat in a small room with pale yellow walls, clutching a stuffed bear someone had handed her. She didn't cry, just asked quiet questions. "Where's my mom? Why am I here?" There's no way to explain something like that to a 13-year-old. We told her the truth slowly, piece by piece. That her mother was gone. That the people who raised her weren't who they said they were. That she had a father who'd never stopped looking for her. When she finally understood, she pressed her palms to her ears like she could block out the sound of it. I left that room with a heaviness I can still feel if I think about it long enough. The trial began the following winter. Linda came into court dressed in a plain gray suit, her hair tied back, her expression cold. Robert pled guilty before the proceedings started and agreed to testify. His statement filled in the blanks: the abduction, the birth, the murder, the years spent hiding in plain sight. He spoke softly, eyes fixed on the table, describing how they'd buried Jennifer, how Linda had forged the documents and passed off the child as their own. When the prosecutor asked why he'd gone along with it, he said, "Because I thought love could fix her." I was wrong. Those words stayed with me. They always do, the ones that sound like confessions from the edge of a cliff. Linda refused to look at him while he spoke. When it was her turn, her lawyer argued. Diminished capacity said she'd been suffering from depression and hormonal imbalance, that she wasn't in her right mind. But the psychiatrists saw through it. She'd planned enough to fake records enough to hide a body. That wasn't confusion, it was calculation. During testimony, they showed the jury the box she'd kept hidden in her closet. Inside were baby keepsakes, tiny socks, a birth certificate printed on stolen county paper, and at the bottom, sealed in a plastic bag, the hospital bracelet she'd taken off Jennifer's wrist before burying her. I watched the jurors' faces when that evidence came up. You could feel the air go heavy in the room. David sat through every day of that trial, sometimes with his hands folded, sometimes gripping the edge of the bench so tight his knuckles went white. When Robert described Jennifer's final hours, David looked down at the floor, eyes shut, his jaw set. I caught myself doing the same. You can't hear details like that without feeling a piece of your own faith in the world shift. The verdict came quick. Guilty on all counts: first-degree murder, kidnapping, tampering with evidence. Life without parole. Robert got 25 years for second-degree murder and cooperation. When the judge read the sentence, Linda didn't flinch. She just stared straight ahead like she'd finally reached the end of a story she'd been writing for too long. Afterward, when the courtroom cleared, I walked David outside. He stood on the courthouse steps for a while, his hands buried in his coat pockets, watching snow start to fall. "She's really gone," he said quietly. "But the girl, she's still here." I told him the state was arranging supervised meetings once Maya's therapists cleared it. He nodded, eyes still on the snow. "She's all that's left of Jennifer," he said. "I want her to know her mother wasn't some story people whisper about. She was real." The first meeting happened in a counselor's office a few weeks later. I wasn't in the room, but the staff told me how it went. David brought a photo album and a small box. Inside were pieces of Jennifer's life-old Polaroids, a folded note from high school, a baby blanket she'd sewn herself. Maya barely spoke at first. Then she asked if her mother had really loved her. David told her she'd been excited from the moment she found out she was pregnant, that she'd written letters to the baby before she was born. The counselor said Maya started crying, then quietly at first, then uncontrollably, until David reached out and let her hold the photos. She pressed one to her chest and whispered, "I look like her." From that point on, it wasn't just a case anymore. It was two lives trying to rebuild from the same broken pieces. Maya stayed with a foster family for a while before moving in with David and his wife Rachel. It wasn't easy, too much history, too much pain, but they tried. Therapy helped. So did small things. Family dinners, walks by the river, the way David never forced her to talk about the past. When she turned 15, she asked to visit her mother's grave. They went together, stood beneath the maple trees that ring the cemetery. Maya laid the yellow baby blanket, still soft, still bright on the grass. She chose this color, David told her. Maya nodded. "Then I'll keep it." For me, the case changed how I saw the job. I'd been doing this long enough to know justice doesn't always look like healing. Sometimes it's just truth finally standing in daylight. But this one felt different. Maybe because of the years between the crime and the reckoning. Maybe because a child who should have been a headline was alive, learning to live with what had been taken from her. Linda Chen's cell sits in the women's correctional facility downstate. I went once as part of a post-conviction interview. She looked smaller than I remembered, older too, though not from time, more from the collapse of all that pretending. When I asked if she had anything to say to Jennifer's family, she hesitated, then shook her head. "They wouldn't understand," she said. And I knew she was right in a way she didn't mean. Some things live too far beyond reason for understanding to reach them. That night after the drive back, I stopped by the hospital. County Memorial had changed since 2010. New wing, new security system, bright badge readers, glowing green at every exit. The side door where Jennifer walked out was gone, replaced by a wall of reinforced glass. In the lobby stood a small plaque, part of the safety initiative her case had inspired. It read, "In memory of Jennifer Hayes, whose story reminded us to never take protection for granted." I stood there for a while watching families move through the hallways, new fathers fumbling with car seats, nurses wheeling bassinets past. Life moving forward. Out in the parking lot, the lights buzzed faintly against the fog. I could almost picture her there again, just for a moment, a young woman in a hospital gown stepping into the night, unaware of the shadow following her. And then I thought of her daughter, not lost, not hidden anymore, walking somewhere under that same Oregon sky. For the first time in a long while, I felt something close to peace, but I knew the story wasn't finished yet. Because healing never arrives all at once. It comes in fragments over years through people brave enough to face the truth and still choose to live. And that part, the part that belonged to Maya, was only just beginning. There are cases that end when the handcuffs click, when the paperwork's done and the verdict's written in ink. And then there are cases that never really stop living inside you. Jennifer Hayes was one of those. Even after the trial, after the headlines faded and the courtroom emptied, she stayed with me not as a file in a drawer, but as a quiet presence that surfaces in moments you don't expect. A night drive past the hospital, the sound of rain on a windshield, the sight of a young mother holding her child at a crosswalk. It's strange how something so violent, so wrong, can leave behind something gentle, almost sacred, a reminder of how fragile the line between ordinary and unthinkable really is. I visited the Hayes home a few months after everything was over. David had invited me for coffee, said it was something he needed to do. The house looked different, brighter somehow, though I couldn't tell if that was the sunlight or just what time does to pain. Maya was there, too, sitting at the kitchen table working through a math worksheet while a small dog snored under her chair. She'd grown since I last saw her, taller, more sure of herself. When she looked up, there was something of Jennifer in her expression, that same steadiness, that same quiet way of meeting your eyes, like she was taking the measure of your heart before she spoke. David poured coffee and sat across from me. For a while, we didn't talk about the case. We talked about his younger kids, about school and Little League and the new foundation he'd started in Jennifer's name. It funded better hospital security systems and programs for children recovered from abductions, the ones trying to find a way back into the world after years of being told who they were. "It's not about punishment anymore," he said. "It's about making sure someone else gets found sooner than we did." His voice was calm, almost detached, but there was pride under it, the quiet kind that doesn't need to be seen. When Maya joined us, she didn't say much. She sat with her elbows on the table, tracing the rim of her cup. David showed her a picture from an old album, Jennifer in her wedding dress standing under a tree full of blossoms. Maya smiled faintly and said, "She looks happy." David nodded. She was, and she would be now seeing you here. It wasn't the kind of moment that ends with tears or hugs. It was something smaller, a shared stillness that said more than words could. I remember leaving their house that afternoon thinking about how healing doesn't come as a single wave. It comes in pieces, in the sound of laughter creeping back into a home, in the way people start planning for a future again. Maya was living proof of that, a girl who had every reason to be consumed by what happened, choosing instead to learn to volunteer to speak at events about identity and resilience. She didn't forgive Linda. She never pretended to, but she learned to understand the shape of that woman's sickness without letting it define her. That takes a kind of strength most adults never find. Linda Chen stayed behind bars. I heard through the system that she kept mostly to herself. No visitors, no correspondence beyond her lawyers. Robert took the plea deal seriously, worked with investigators to close out the file, helped map the years of deception that followed Jennifer's disappearance. When he faced sentencing, he asked the court to send any compensation he might earn from prison labor to the Hayes Foundation. Maybe guilt can turn into something useful even if it never disappears. As for me, I stayed with the department another few years before retiring for good. But even after I turned in my badge, I couldn't stop checking on cases like Jennifer's. Old files, missing persons reports, open leads, all the names that hang in the space between hope and truth. I think once you've seen what's possible when a community refuses to forget, it's hard to look away again. Every time a new case comes in, I tell the younger detectives the same thing. You're not chasing closure. You're chasing light. The hospital changed after Jennifer's story broke. They rebuilt the security system from the ground up, new keycard locks, alarms that trigger when monitors are disconnected, surveillance that never blinks. There's a memorial plaque near the maternity ward now. Nothing ornate, just a small piece of brass mounted by the window where the fog rolls in from the hills. It reads, "In remembrance of Jennifer Hayes, whose story reminds us that vigilance saves lives." Every year on March 14th, the staff gathers there for a few minutes of silence. I've stood there once or twice myself. It's never about the crime anymore. It's about remembering that safety isn't something you assume. It's something you guard every day, in every place that promises care. Maya's voice began to carry beyond that town. By the time she turned 16, she'd started speaking publicly at conferences in schools through the Foundation's outreach. I watched one of her talks online a while back. She stood on a small stage, steady at the microphone, no notes in front of her. She said she didn't remember her real mother's voice, but she'd read every letter Jennifer had written before she was born. "She called me her light," Maya said. "And I try to live like I still am." There was no dramatics, no trembling, just that quiet conviction that comes when you've already survived the worst thing you can imagine. Sometimes when I think about Jennifer, I picture her as she was in that hospital room, tired but happy, waiting for her life to start. I used to wonder what she must have thought in those last hours, if she had any idea her story would echo this far. But over time, I stopped asking those questions. The truth is, her legacy isn't what was done to her. It's the daughter she left behind, the one who found her way home. Justice, when it came, was imperfect. It always is. The law can punish, but it can't return time. It can't give a child the birthdays she never had, or a husband the future he planned. What it can do is carve out a small space for peace, a line between the past and the days that follow. For the Hayes family, that space became a kind of sanctuary, a place where grief could live without consuming everything else. Years later, when I drive through that part of Oregon, I still take the long way past the old hospital. I'll park for a moment near the edge of the lot and watch the lights glowing in the windows. Life goes on in there, new mothers, new babies, the sound of laughter carrying down the halls. And every so often I'll see someone standing by that plaque tracing the engraved letters with their fingertips. Maybe a nurse who wasn't even working there back then, or a parent who just needed a moment of stillness before heading home. It reminds me that stories don't end where we file them away. They linger, teaching us to look closer, to care, harder, to never mistake safety for certainty. I keep Jennifer's case file in my home office. Not on a shelf, but in a drawer I open sometimes just to read her name again. There's comfort in knowing it's there, not forgotten, not buried in the archives. The photograph clipped to the inside cover shows her holding that yellow baby blanket, the one her daughter later laid at her grave. I think about that image often, about how love can travel farther than the body, through time, through pain, even through lies, and still find its way back. The world keeps moving. David's foundation has expanded to other states, now hospitals adopting its model. Maya's applying to college. She wants to study medicine, maybe become a nurse though, for reasons only she fully understands. The irony isn't lost on anyone, but that's what healing looks like sometimes, walking straight into the shadow of what once broke you and turning on a light. I've told this story more times than I can count, to trainees, to community groups, sometimes just to myself on long drives when the night feels too quiet. It always ends the same way with that bracelet. A small circle of plastic that once held a name, lost for 13 years and found again. That's all a story like this really is, a circle trying to close. And maybe that's enough. If this story stayed with you, share it, not for views, not for numbers, but so no one's name gets lost to the dark. Because somewhere out there, another file waits for the right person to notice what doesn't fit, to listen to the small voice saying, "Check again." That's how Jennifer was found. And that's how light keeps breaking through even after the longest night.